The divorce papers were placed into my hands in the stillness of my father's funeral, where every face was heavy with grief. My husband stepped forward, and in front of everyone who had gathered to mourn, he handed me documents I never imagined I would sign there. My fingers still trembled from the simple act of writing my name as the daughter of the deceased in the guest book. And now I was staring at a reality I hadn't foreseen. No one said a word. The room held its breath, frozen in a mixture of shock and disbelief. I looked around and saw eyes silently asking if this could possibly be real. I took the pen. Tears welled up, but so did a quiet resolve deep inside me. This moment wasn't just an ending. It was the turning point that would define everything that came next. I signed, and in that instant, I knew with absolute clarity that this was not the final chapter of my story. It was the start of his regret. For a few seconds I couldn't move. Not because I was deciding what to do, but because my body simply stopped responding. My fingers still held the pen, hovering above the paper, while everything around me continued in slow motion. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Someone cleared their throat. A cup clinked against a saucer. I stayed still. People were watching, even if they pretended not to be. I could feel their eyes on me, careful, uncertain, almost apologetic. No one knew whether to step in or step back. No one wanted to be the person who made this moment worse. My husband stepped away, already acting as if the decision had been handled. He didn't look at me again. That hurt more than the papers themselves. I didn't follow him. I stood there holding my breath, staring at nothing in particular. The noise around me faded until all I could hear was the quiet rush of blood in my ears. My thoughts didn't race. They froze. It felt like my mind had shut a door just to keep me upright. This was grief layered on top of grief. Losing my father had hollowed me out. This was something else entirely. This was betrayal arriving at the worst possible moment, when I had no strength left to defend myself. Someone touched my arm gently. I didn't turn to see who it was. I nodded, more out of instinct than awareness. I couldn't speak. If I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure what would come out. Around me, people whispered. Not gossip, concern. Shock. Disbelief. I caught fragments of sentences drifting through the air. Is she okay? Did that really just happen? I wanted to disappear. Not dramatically, just quietly. I wanted the floor to give me somewhere to hide. Somewhere private enough to fall apart. But it didn't. So I stayed where I was, perfectly still, like if I didn't move, the moment might lose its grip on me. My chest felt tight, but no tears came. I wasn't numb. I was suspended, caught between what had just happened and what I wasn't ready to face yet. I realized something in that silence. Everyone thought I was breaking. But the truth was I was pausing. I wasn't reacting because reacting would have given the moment more power than it deserved. I needed space, time, control. And in that quiet standstill, while people watched, unsure of what came next, I held on to the only thing I still had, my composure. Because whatever this moment was meant to take from me, I wasn't going to give it everything. Before that day, my life didn't feel dramatic or fragile. It felt steady, predictable, ordinary in a way I had learned to appreciate. If you had asked me then, I would have told you I was doing fine. I had a marriage that looked solid from the outside. A routine that made sense. A future I believed was already mapped out, even if it wasn't perfect. I didn't wake up every morning worried about what might fall apart. I assumed the important things were secure. That belief mattered more than I realized. My father was still alive then. Not healthy but present. His voice still filled the house during phone calls. His advice still grounded me when I felt unsure. Knowing he was there made everything else feel manageable. And my husband, he was there too. Not in grand gestures, not in dramatic declarations, but in small, consistent ways that felt enough at the time. We shared meals. We talked about plans. We moved through life side by side without questioning the direction. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt dangerous. Looking back now, that calm feels almost unreal. Not because it was fake, but because it was temporary and I didn't know it yet. There were no warnings loud enough to scare me. No obvious cracks I could point to and say this is where it started. Just life unfolding the way it always had. Busy days. Quiet nights. Conversations that ended without tension. I trusted that rhythm. I trusted that grief, when it came, would be something we faced together. I trusted that marriage meant stability when things got hard, not distance. I trusted that respect didn't disappear just because circumstances changed. Those assumptions felt reasonable at the time. If someone had told me that one day I would be standing at my father's funeral, holding divorce papers instead of condolences, I wouldn't have believed them. I would have laughed it off. Said that kind of thing only happens in extreme stories, not real life. And yet, here I was. What I didn't understand back then, what I couldn't see, was how quietly things can shift without making a sound. How people can change their intentions long before they change their behavior. How decisions can be made in silence while you're still living in good faith. That's the part that stays with me now. Because nothing truly broke all at once. It loosened. Slowly. Quietly. And I didn't realize anything was wrong. Until I was already standing in the aftermath, trying to remember when safety stopped being something I could count on. What happened next didn't come out of nowhere. It just waited for the moment I was least prepared to see it. My days used to follow a rhythm that felt reliable. I woke up early, not because I loved mornings but because life demanded it. Work emails. Coffee that tasted better at home than anywhere else. Small routines that made the day feel manageable before it even began. Nothing exciting but nothing alarming either. My marriage fit neatly into that rhythm. We weren't dramatic. We didn't fight loudly or post perfect moments online. From the outside, we probably looked like any other couple just trying to keep life together. Shared bills. Shared plans. Conversations about work, weekends, and what needed fixing around the house. It felt normal. In the evenings, we sat in the same room doing different things. He scrolled through his phone. I caught up on messages or watched something mindless just to quiet my thoughts. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. Silence didn't scare me back then. I thought it meant comfort. I didn't question the distance because it wasn't obvious. He still asked how my day went. Still showed up to family gatherings. Still played the role of a dependable partner when others were around. There were no raised voices. No sudden coldness. No moments dramatic enough to ring alarm bells. That's what made it easy to believe everything was fine. My father's illness had already taught me how fragile life could be. So I clung to what felt steady. I needed something solid to hold on to, and my marriage seemed like that thing. It gave me structure when everything else felt uncertain. I told myself we were just tired. That adulthood looked like this. That love didn't always feel intense. It felt practical, supportive, familiar. And I accepted that version of it without questioning whether something deeper was missing. Weekends passed quietly. Groceries. Laundry. Short conversations about plans that never felt urgent. We talked about the future in vague terms, assuming there would be time to figure things out later. There was always later. I didn't notice how often I was the one adjusting. Lowering expectations. Choosing not to push conversations. Letting small disappointments slide because I believed commitment meant patience. I wasn't unhappy, I just wasn't fully seen. And at the time that felt like a reasonable compromise. People around us never asked if things were okay. That alone reassured me. If something were wrong, surely someone would have noticed. Surely I would have felt it more clearly. But stability can be misleading. It doesn't announce when it's slipping. It doesn't warn you before it changes shape. It simply becomes something you assume will always be there, until the day it isn't. I believed my life was balanced. I believed my marriage was safe. I believed that when the hardest moments arrived, the foundation I was standing on would hold. Those beliefs didn't come from denial. They came from trust. And that trust was the reason I never saw what was quietly being decided without me, until it was already too late to stop it. The signs didn't arrive loudly. They slipped in quietly, disguised as ordinary moments, small enough to explain away, easy enough to forgive. At the time, none of them felt serious. That's what made them dangerous. It started with conversations that ended too quickly. I would say something that mattered to me, and he would nod without really listening. Not dismissive, just distant. Like his attention was already somewhere else. I told myself he was tired. We both were. Life had been heavy. Especially with my father's health declining. Everyone deserved grace. Then there were the changes in his schedule. Nothing dramatic. Just later nights. Earlier exits. Vague explanations that sounded reasonable when you didn't think about them too hard. Work stuff. Meetings. Connections I need to maintain. I didn't press for details because I didn't want to be that person, the suspicious wife, the nag. Trust felt easier than confrontation. Sometimes I noticed a tension when my father came up in conversation. A slight shift. A pause that lasted half a second too long. I couldn't explain it and I didn't try. I assumed I was projecting my own stress onto him. Grief has a way of distorting things, or so I thought. There were moments when his kindness felt rehearsed. The words were right, but the timing felt off. Support offered when people were watching. Concern that faded when it was just the two of us. I noticed it, felt it briefly in my chest, and then pushed it away. I told myself love doesn't always show up perfectly. Another sign came in the form of impatience. Not anger, just a subtle urgency. Like he was always waiting for something to happen. Always checking the time. Always mentally one step ahead of the moment we were actually in. It made me feel like I was slowing him down without knowing why. I adjusted again. I spoke less. Asked fewer questions. Learned which topics made him disengage and quietly removed them from conversation. That felt like maturity back then. Like compromise. Like choosing peace. There were nights I lay awake next to him, staring at the ceiling, feeling an unspoken distance that didn't have a name yet. I didn't suspect betrayal. I didn't imagine cruelty. I just felt unsettled. But unsettled isn't enough to accuse someone. And I wasn't ready to admit that something might be wrong when everything else in my life already felt like it was falling apart. I needed stability. I needed one thing I didn't have to question. So I ignored the feeling. I ignored how rarely he asked about my father anymore. Ignored how discussions about the future suddenly felt rushed or transactional. Ignored the way he spoke about timing and practical decisions, as if emotions were optional. Nothing here was proof. Just discomfort. Just instinct. Just quiet signals I wasn't ready to translate. I convinced myself that marriages go through phases. That closeness ebbs and flows. That love doesn't disappear. It just changes form. What I didn't realize then was this. While I was choosing patience, someone else was choosing strategy. While I was protecting peace, someone else was preparing an exit. And while I told myself these were just small things that didn't matter, they were already shaping the moment that would eventually break everything wide open. The shift didn't come with an argument. There was no dramatic confrontation. No raised voices. No moment where everything suddenly made sense. It arrived quietly, so quietly that I almost missed it. It was an ordinary morning. The kind that blends into every other one. Coffee cooling on the counter. Light filtering through the window. The house still, except for the soft sounds of a day beginning. Nothing felt different until it did. I noticed something small first. A message notification flashed on his phone while it rested face up on the table. He reached for it too quickly. Not panicked. Just fast. Instinctive. Like muscle memory. The screen went dark before I could see anything. But the movement stayed with me longer than it should have. My chest tightened. Not because I knew something, because I felt it. Later that day, I replayed the moment in my head while doing completely unrelated things. Folding laundry. Waiting at a red light. Standing in line at the store. The memory kept resurfacing uninvited, bringing with it a quiet sense of unease I couldn't shake. That's when I realized something had changed. I was no longer assuming the best without thinking. I was observing. I noticed how his answers were just a little too smooth. How explanations came quickly, already polished. How his tone stayed calm even when the questions were simple. Not defensive but controlled. It felt calculated in a way I couldn't yet name. That evening we sat in the same room without really sharing the space. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was strategic. I could feel it. Like we were both holding cards close to our chests. Even though I didn't know why I had started doing the same. I didn't accuse him. I didn't ask for clarity. Instead, I listened differently. I paid attention to what he didn't say. To the pauses. To the way certain topics never quite landed. To the distance that had been growing so slowly I'd mistaken it for normal life stress. Something inside me clicked. Not loudly but decisively. I stopped filling in the gaps for him. I stopped defending his behavior in my own head. And that was the real shift. Because once you stop explaining things away, the truth starts to breathe. I remember standing alone later that night, looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked tired. Older somehow. Not just from grief, but from carrying uncertainty without acknowledging it. I whispered to myself, pay attention. Not react. Not confront. Just pay attention. That was the day I understood that whatever was happening didn't begin with betrayal. It began with intention. With choices made quietly. With decisions I wasn't part of. And even then I stayed silent. Because part of me wasn't ready to know everything yet. And another part, one I didn't fully understand at the time, was already preparing for something I couldn't see coming. The noise hadn't arrived yet, but the silence had changed. And once silence changes, everything that follows becomes inevitable. Nothing prepares you for the moment a life actually ends. You can fear it. You can anticipate it. You can even say the words out loud, it's coming. But when it finally happens, your body reacts before your mind ever catches up. The call came early. Too early for good news. Too early for explanations. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to my ear, listening to words that didn't feel real as they were being said. My father was gone. Just like that. No long goodbye. No final conversation. One moment he existed in the world and the next he didn't. I couldn't cry at first. Shock wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. Everything slowed down. My hands felt numb. My thoughts moved in fragments. I kept asking the same question even though I already knew the answer. Are you sure? I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember standing up. I only remember the weight in my chest growing heavier with every breath, like something vital had been removed without warning. My father wasn't just my parent. He was my anchor. My constant. The person who had been there before everything else in my life, and the one I assumed would always be there after. Losing him felt like losing the ground beneath me. The house filled with people quickly. Voices. Movement. Sympathy wrapped in soft tones. Hands touching my arm, my shoulder, my back. Everyone meant well, but it all blurred together. I nodded. I thanked them. I existed on autopilot because feeling everything at once would have shattered me. My husband stayed close, but not in the way I needed. He was present, technically. Standing nearby. Saying the right things when others were listening. But when the room emptied and the noise faded, there was a distance I couldn't explain. A hesitation. As if grief had shifted something between us that neither of us named. I didn't question it. I didn't have the strength. Grief stripped me down to my most vulnerable state. I wasn't thinking ahead. I wasn't watching for signs anymore. I was surviving 1 minute at a time, moving through arrangements and decisions that felt surreal and cruelly practical. I signed paperwork with shaking hands. I made phone calls I didn't remember making. I chose flowers while trying not to collapse. Every choice felt too heavy. Every moment felt unreal. And through it all, I kept thinking the same thing. I can't handle anything else. That was the truth. My heart was exposed. My defenses were gone. I was standing in the most fragile place a person can stand. Grieving deeply, exhausted emotionally, and trusting that the people closest to me wouldn't make this harder. I didn't know then that the stakes had just changed forever. Because when you lose someone who protected you, someone who grounded you, you become open in a way you don't recognize until it's too late. I thought the worst had already happened. I thought grief was the deepest pain I would feel. I didn't realize that while I was mourning my father, someone else was quietly preparing to take advantage of the exact moment I was least able to fight back. The room was full, but I had never felt more alone. People stood close together, speaking in low voices, holding cups they didn't really drink from. The air was heavy with grief and politeness, the kind that exists when everyone is trying to behave appropriately around someone else's pain. I stood there, numb, barely aware of my own body, still moving through the motions of a day I never wanted to live through. That's when he stepped forward. Not suddenly. Not aggressively. Calm. Measured. Like he had rehearsed this moment in his head long before it arrived. He called my name softly, the way someone does when they want to appear caring. When I turned, he was already holding the folder. Thin. Ordinary. Nothing about it looked dangerous until it was in my hands. Divorce papers. Right there. In public. In the middle of my father's funeral reception. For a second, I thought I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. My brain tried to protect me, to reinterpret reality into something less cruel. But the words were clear. The intent was clearer. This was deliberate. He leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that it felt intimate, private, even though everyone was watching. "This is the right thing," he said gently. "Your dad would want you to be practical." He used my father as leverage. That was the moment something inside me cracked. My father's body was still nearby. The grief hadn't even settled yet, and he was already weaponizing it, turning my loss into pressure, turning my vulnerability into strategy. I felt eyes on us from every direction. Conversations stopped. People sensed something was wrong, even if they couldn't hear the words. Someone inhaled sharply. Someone else looked away, embarrassed on my behalf. No one intervened, not because they didn't care, but because no one knew how to step into something this cruel without making it worse. He knew that. He counted on it. He stood there, composed, confident, certain I wouldn't refuse him in front of an audience. Certain grief would silence me. Certain I would prioritize dignity over resistance. And he was right about part of it. My hands were shaking as I looked down at the papers. My name printed beneath his. A future erased in black ink. My heart pounding so loudly I was sure others could hear it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the folder on the floor and walk away. But grief does strange things to you. It narrows your focus. It steals your strength. It makes survival feel like compliance. He placed the pen in my hand like it was a formality. And in that moment I understood exactly what he was trying to do. This wasn't just divorce. This was control. This was him choosing the one place and time where I was least able to protect myself and striking. Everyone was watching, waiting, judging. I could feel my father's absence like a physical ache in my chest. The man who would have stood between me and this cruelty was gone. And the person who should have been protecting me was the one causing it. I signed. Not because I agreed. Not because I accepted it. But because I refused to give him the reaction he expected. As the pen left the paper I lifted my eyes and something changed. He thought he had just destroyed me. What he didn't know was that he had just exposed himself. And once someone reveals who they truly are, they lose the power they thought they had over you. From the outside, my silence probably looked like weakness. People later asked why I didn't argue. Why I didn't refuse. Why I didn't cause a scene or demand answers in that moment. Some assumed I was too broken to respond. Others thought I had simply given up. The truth was quieter than all of that. I didn't fight back because I understood where I was standing. I was in a room filled with grief, mine and everyone else's. My father was being honored. People had come to say goodbye to him, not to witness the collapse of my marriage. Turning that space into chaos would have rewritten the meaning of the day in a way I couldn't undo. I chose not to let that happen. There was also the weight of exhaustion. Grief drains you in ways no one can prepare you for. Every emotion feels heavier. Every decision costs more. I was operating on the bare minimum required to stay upright. Fighting would have required energy I simply didn't have to give. But silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes silence is restraint. I understood something else too, something instinctive. Arguing there wouldn't have changed his mind. It wouldn't have brought clarity or justice. It would have given him exactly what he wanted. A reaction, a distraction, a moment where emotions overpowered reason. I wasn't going to hand that to him. By staying calm, I kept control over the only thing still fully mine, my dignity. I didn't need witnesses to my pain. I didn't need validation from a room full of people who were already overwhelmed. What mattered was not how loud I was in that moment. What mattered was what came next. Silence gave me time. Time to breathe. Time to think. Time to let the shock settle without committing myself to words I might later regret. There's a misconception that strength always looks loud, that power announces itself through confrontation. But sometimes strength is quiet. Sometimes it's choosing not to engage when engagement would only deepen the damage. I didn't fight back because I wasn't finished yet. Because something inside me was already shifting from survival to awareness. I didn't fully understand it then, but I knew enough to pause, to wait, to observe. And there was one more truth I hadn't articulated yet, even to myself. I wasn't ready to reveal everything I knew. There were things he didn't realize, things he assumed, pieces of the situation he thought were settled when they weren't. Fighting back in that moment would have tipped my hand. So I stayed silent. Not because I was powerless, but because I was choosing when and how to reclaim my power. And sometimes the most powerful move you can make is not making one at all. What they didn't know was that the story hadn't started at the funeral. They thought the moment they saw the pen, the papers, the silence was the beginning. They believed everything that mattered was happening right there, in that room in front of witnesses. It wasn't. That day had already unfolded in ways no one could see. Hours before I stood beside my father's coffin, before condolences and flowers and hushed voices filled the air, I had learned something that changed the ground beneath my feet. Something that reframed everything I thought I understood about my life, my marriage, and my future. And once you know certain things, you don't react the same way anymore. I didn't walk into that funeral unaware. I walked in carrying information, quiet, heavy, decisive. Knowledge that sat in my chest while everyone else saw only a grieving daughter holding herself together by habit alone. What they didn't know was that the situation my husband believed he was controlling had already shifted. He thought timing was his advantage. He thought grief would make me agreeable. He thought presenting those papers in public would corner me into compliance. But he never asked what my morning had looked like before that moment. He never asked where I had been. He never questioned why I seemed so still. Because stillness looks like defeat to people who confuse noise with power. Earlier that day, I had signed documents he had no idea existed. Documents that changed outcomes, not optics. Papers that carried weight far beyond the ones he handed me. While he believed he was closing a door, another one had already been sealed. Quietly, legally, and permanently. The power shift didn't happen when I signed his papers. It happened before he ever walked into that room. He thought he was exposing me. In reality, he was exposing himself. Everything he relied on, my trust, my vulnerability, my lack of preparation, was already gone. He just didn't know it yet. And because he didn't know, he moved confidently, carelessly, as people often do when they believe they're ahead. That confidence became his mistake. There's a strange clarity that comes when you realize someone has underestimated you. Not in an insulting way, but in a dangerous one. They stop being cautious. They stop checking details. They assume the outcome is guaranteed. That's when traps work. I didn't need to explain myself to anyone in that room. I didn't need to justify my silence or announce my awareness. The truth didn't need an audience. It just needed time. What they didn't know was that the woman they saw standing there, quiet, pale, grieving, was not unprepared. She was waiting. And waiting is not the same as losing. Because when you already know how the story is going to unfold, you don't interrupt it. You let it move forward exactly as planned, until the moment it turns. And when it does, it turns hard. Just not in the way they expected. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It came in pieces, small fractures in the confidence they had been standing on. Moments where certainty wavered. Where assumptions stopped lining up the way they were supposed to. First there was confusion. Questions asked twice. Phone calls that went unanswered. A tone shift I recognized immediately because I had heard it before, just never directed inward. The calm assurance faded. In its place came urgency, thinly disguised as professionalism. He started reaching out more. Not with apologies. Not with remorse. But with concern dressed up as practicality. Messages about details. About next steps. About things that suddenly felt less settled than he had expected. That was when I knew. The truth had started to surface. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. Watching someone realize they've miscalculated is far more revealing than any argument. You see it in how they rush. How they over-explain. How their confidence turns sharp at the edges. He had believed the story was finished. Now he was realizing it wasn't even close. The panic showed itself subtly at first. A change in posture. A hesitation before speaking. The way his words no longer landed with the same certainty. He asked questions he had never bothered to ask before. Checked things he had once assumed were handled. Regret followed soon after. Not the kind that comes from empathy, but the kind that comes from loss of control. The realization that a decision made too confidently had consequences he hadn't anticipated. That his timing, which he believed was perfect, had actually worked against him. And once regret appears, consequences aren't far behind. What struck me most wasn't his fear. It was his disbelief. The way he struggled to accept that I had known more than he thought. That I had acted without revealing my hand. That silence hadn't meant ignorance. People who rely on manipulation rarely consider the possibility that they're being observed in return. They assume they're the only ones thinking ahead. The shift was unmistakable. Where there had been certainty, there was now damage control. Where there had been strategy, there was scrambling. He tried to reframe conversations, to soften statements, to revisit decisions he had been so confident about just days earlier. Too late. The truth doesn't announce itself loudly when it arrives. It settles in. It stays. And once it does, it changes everything. I watched him realize that the moment he thought had secured his future was actually the moment it began to unravel. That the papers he handed me so confidently were no longer the leverage he believed them to be. And in that realization, something else appeared. Fear. Not fear of losing me. Fear of losing the advantage he thought he had. That's when the balance truly shifted. Because once someone realizes they're no longer in control, every move they make becomes reactive, desperate, transparent. I didn't need to say a word. The truth was already doing the work for me. And this time it wasn't going to be quiet. What came next didn't look like revenge the way people imagine it. There was no shouting, no public humiliation, no dramatic confrontation designed to hurt for the sake of hurting. And that was intentional. Because the most effective revenge isn't loud, it's precise. While he was still trying to regain control, still reaching out through lawyers and carefully worded messages, everything was already moving forward exactly as it needed to. Quietly, legally, without emotion clouding judgment. That's the part people misunderstand. Revenge doesn't have to be cruel to be complete. I didn't need to attack him. I didn't need to expose him publicly, or say a single unnecessary word. All I had to do was stand still and let the truth operate the way truth always does. Slowly, thoroughly, and without mercy. Every document was already in place. Every decision had already been made. Every safeguard had already been built. He thought power came from timing. He was wrong. Power came from preparation. What unraveled him wasn't anger. It was reality. The kind that doesn't bend no matter how convincingly you argue. The kind that doesn't respond to manipulation or charm. The kind that exists on paper, in signatures, in facts that can't be rewritten. There was dignity in that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him. I didn't even explain myself. I allowed the legal process to speak for me, because it was far more effective than emotion ever could be. That's when he realized something he hadn't considered. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was protecting myself. And there's a difference. Everything he had done relied on the assumption that I would react emotionally, that grief would make me impulsive, that silence meant confusion, that calm meant weakness. He underestimated the kind of strength that comes from restraint. He didn't lose because I fought back. He lost because I didn't. Because I didn't interrupt him while he made his mistakes. Because I didn't correct him when he misunderstood the situation. Because I let him move forward under the illusion that he was still in control. That illusion did more damage than anything I could have said. The consequences unfolded naturally, predictably, exactly the way they do when someone builds their confidence on assumptions instead of truth. No cruelty was required, only patience. And through it all I stayed intact. I didn't compromise my values. I didn't sacrifice my dignity. I didn't become someone I wouldn't recognize later. That mattered more to me than any momentary satisfaction. Because real revenge isn't about watching someone suffer. It's about watching them realize they never had the power they thought they did. It's about walking away whole, while they're left trying to understand how everything slipped through their fingers without a single dramatic blow. I didn't need to punish him. Life handled that part on its own. All I had to do was let it. The final confrontation didn't happen the way people expect these moments to happen. There was no raised voice. No slammed doors. No dramatic accusations flying back and forth. It was quiet, almost unsettlingly so. We sat across from each other in a neutral space, the kind of place chosen specifically to remove emotion from the equation. A table between us. Papers neatly arranged. No audience. No performance required. For the first time since everything began, there was nowhere for him to hide. He looked different. Not angry. Not defensive. Just smaller. The confidence that once carried him was gone, replaced by something brittle. He avoided eye contact at first, then tried too hard to hold it. His words came slower now, measured in a way they hadn't been before. This wasn't a man preparing to take something from me. This was a man realizing what he had already lost. He spoke first as if rehearsed. Explanations. Justifications. Statements that sounded reasonable on the surface but fell apart under their own weight. He talked about timing, about pressure, about things getting out of control. I listened without interrupting. Not because I agreed, but because I no longer needed to argue. At some point his voice trailed off. The silence stretched longer than either of us expected. And in that pause something shifted. He finally understood that I wasn't there to negotiate. I wasn't there to convince him of anything. I was there to close the door. He asked one question quietly, almost carefully. Did you know? It was the only honest thing he'd said in a long time. I nodded once. That was all it took. No explanation. No timeline. No details. Just confirmation. The realization hit him slowly, like weight settling where it couldn't be moved. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and for the first time said nothing at all. There was regret there, but not the kind that seeks forgiveness. The kind that recognizes a miscalculation too late. The kind that comes when someone understands that the moment they thought gave them power actually took it away. I felt something unexpected then. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Relief. Because closure doesn't come from winning an argument. Comes from clarity. From knowing that there is nothing left to say, nothing left to explain, nothing left to fix. I stood up before he did. Not dramatically. Not defiantly. Simply finished. As I walked away, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was stepping out of something that no longer belonged to me. That meeting wasn't about him understanding me. It was about me understanding that I was done. And that was enough. I didn't recognize myself at first. Not because I had changed into someone unkind or hardened, but because I had finally stopped shrinking. The version of me that existed after everything was quieter, steadier, and far more certain than the woman I had been before. Grief had stripped me down. Not gently. Not gradually. It removed everything unnecessary and left me standing with only what was real. Fear didn't disappear, but it no longer controlled my decisions. Doubt didn't vanish, but it no longer dictated my worth. For the first time in a long time, my life belonged to me. I learned how much of myself I had given away without noticing. How often I had softened my voice, adjusted my expectations, delayed my needs to keep things peaceful. I had confused compromise with survival, and mistook silence for harmony. That version of me didn't disappear. She just stopped leading. Independence didn't arrive as a dramatic declaration. It settled in quietly. In small deliberate choices. In moments where I no longer checked with someone else before trusting my own judgment. In decisions made without explaining myself to anyone. I built routines that were mine alone. Mornings that started without tension. Evenings that didn't feel like something to endure. Spaces that reflected who I was, not who I was trying to be for someone else. And in that stillness I found clarity. I stopped defining myself by roles I had outgrown. I was no longer someone's wife navigating around someone else's ambitions. I was a woman capable of standing in loss without losing herself. The grief never fully left, but it changed shape. It became memory instead of weight. Presence instead of absence. My father was gone, but the strength he gave me remained. It showed up in the way I carried myself now. In the way I trusted my instincts without apology. I didn't become colder. I became clearer. Clearer about boundaries. Clearer about what I would and wouldn't accept. Clearer about the difference between love and control. There was freedom in that clarity. Not the reckless kind, but the grounded kind. The kind that comes from knowing you can survive the worst moment of your life and still choose to move forward with integrity intact. I stopped waiting for validation. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't invested in my well-being. I stopped mistaking endurance for strength. The woman who emerged from everything wasn't louder or more aggressive. She didn't seek revenge or approval. She was simply unmovable. And that was the greatest transformation of all. Because when you know who you are, when you've stood in the aftermath and still chosen yourself, you no longer need to prove anything. You just live. Fully. Losing my father was the deepest pain I have ever known. There are no words that truly capture what it feels like when the person who shaped you, protected you, and believed in you without conditions is suddenly gone. Some days the grief still arrives without warning, quiet, sharp, and heavy in my chest. That loss will always be part of me. But it wasn't the only loss in this story. Because while I was burying my father, my husband was losing something he would never get back. He didn't lose me in a courtroom. He didn't lose me on paper. He didn't even lose me the day I signed those documents. He lost me the moment he chose to use my grief as leverage. That choice drew a line he could never step back across. I didn't walk away angry. I walked away awake. Awake to the reality of who he was. Awake to the fact that love doesn't demand silence, compliance, or sacrifice of self-worth. Awake to how much strength I had been carrying without ever naming it. My father raised me to recognize integrity, even when it's quiet. Especially when it's quiet. And in the end, that lesson mattered more than any protection he could have offered in person. I lost him, but I kept everything he gave me. His values. His steadiness. His belief that dignity matters most when it's hardest to hold on to. The man who handed me those papers thought he was ending something. He was wrong. He ended his access to my life, to my loyalty, to my future. He ended the version of me that made excuses for behavior that didn't deserve understanding. And that loss, that kind of loss, doesn't come with sympathy. Comes with permanence. I don't tell this story to celebrate revenge. I tell it because sometimes strength looks like silence. Sometimes power looks like patience. And sometimes the most defining moment of your life happens when everything is taken from you. Accept your self-respect. If you've ever been in a moment where grief and betrayal collided, if you've ever felt powerless while everyone watched, if you've ever chosen dignity over destruction, you're not alone. And if there's one thing this story proves, it's this. You can lose someone you love and still refuse to lose yourself. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from, USA, UK, or Canada? And if you were in her place, would you have signed the papers, or would you have done something different? Tell me in the comments. Before you leave this story behind, take a quiet moment with it. Stories like this aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to be felt. Somewhere inside it, there's usually a moment that hits closer than we expect. A line, a decision, a silence, a choice that makes you pause and think, what would I have done? So I want to ask you gently, if you were standing in that room, if grief had already taken everything out of you, if the person you trusted most chose the moment you were weakest, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have walked away? Or would you have done exactly what she did? Stayed quiet, protected your dignity, and waited? There's no right or wrong answer here. Just honesty. If this story stirred something in you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience, your perspective, your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about resilience, quiet strength, and emotional justice, you're always welcome to stay.